In mid-2015, the world was shaken by a revolution. There was talk of the media lying to people, spreading hate speech, delivering crude judgment among those who didn't deserve it. All of these allegations came from the Republican nominee of Donald Trump. What he and his campaign symbolized are pretty obvious to see now, and even with hindsight being 2020, it's worth taking a look at to see where journalism has gone. And our story starts all the way in the 1890s. During this time, a lot of journalists, especially with the popularity of newspapers, would write articles that were just filled with blatant lies. These articles would then be coined yellow journalism because of the fact that they would be chock full of lies, misinterpretations, and they would seldom be fact-checked. And while these stories were never particularly proven, it's kind of interesting to see how journalism could be one of those industries that goes belly up and just strives for profit. But over time, people realized that even though this was a common occurrence, that just because something is commonplace doesn't mean it's not worth taking a look at. And as such, journalism and the art of reporting news became much more redeemed. Not only were journalists fact-checking the government and the stories themselves, they were fact-checking the people writing those stories, making sure that every aspect of it was up to par. And as syndication grew from newspapers to television, this problem kind of struck again with the growth of a lot of 24-hour, constant, real newscasters. It became harder to be able to fact-check every story that pulled through. And so it kind of started up again. But nowhere close to the extent of the 1890s. That being said, though, takes us directly into the modern era. An era in which one person with $1 billion to his name saying that the media is dishonest, that it's biased, that it isn't credible, sparks a fire that had been dormant in people for years. Ever since the Trump campaign, there have been multiple congressmen, representatives going up for election who have ran similar Trump-style campaigns, using multiple tactics to delegitimize the media and to make certain that their influence will not be heard. And they succeeded to a certain point. In the fallout of the presidential election of 2016, became divided in a way that any fact-checking didn't seem to exist. People, politicians, representatives, spokespeople would just be hired and fired on the sole prospect of them being able to spin stories. The problem with this is that it would become very easy to fact-check these. And as such, it became easier to adapt to fact-checking methods and spin better stories. There are, of course, the more traditional ones, the Sean Spicer with the Trump's inaugural attendance, the voter fraud stories, all of the dossier stories that have come up in the past few years. I feel like the thing that people tend to forget about in this modern era was actually brought up at the 2016 RNC with a few words that Newt Gingrich congressional representative stated. And he, on interview, essentially stated that despite the fact that crime on the FBI's unbiased surveys was down, people didn't feel safe. And why would you go with people's facts that have been checked once, twice, 3 times over when you can make much more profit off of how people feel? And I feel like that quote essentially puts us in where we are today. To put it in John Oliver's words, we have people trying to bring feelings to fact fights, trying to delegitimize the media by targeting people's raw emotions, and it's working to a sense, and that's scary. And as people grow older, as the Anderson Coopers, as the John Olivers, the Trevor Noahs, as the leading journalists move on, it becomes more and more difficult for people to want to step up to this pressure. And with that comes some scary choices along with them. If I make something being skeptical of net neutrality, will I be doxxed? We're getting into an age where just seeking the truth is scary. And that's a problem. And that is why I am more than willing to take up this mantle, to be a journalist, to search for the truth, and to find out why things happen. I've been trained through advanced placement and multiple levels of reading and writing proficiency to not only see the big picture in a story, a situation, a problem, but to see how tiny little cracks in those problems can create big impacts. How did the Currency Act back in revolutionary times go on to format how people traded in the 1840s through 1890s industrial boom? How did the one phrase, fake news, effectively shift how journalists have to go about reporting the real news? And how did even rumors of Russian interference with elections affect how people began trusting journalists, began trusting candidates, began trusting people? In this day and age where you could be communicating with someone across the world, or even someone who's just a computer program meant to resemble a person, how do you know what to trust? And those notions are scary, but we need people in this next generation of your doctors, your lawyers, your actors and actresses. We need journalists, congressmen, and legislators who are going to be willing to ask those tough questions. We need people who not only do they want to talk about gun control, they are willing to talk about it when it is most relevant. After tragedies like the Parkland shooting that just happened a few months ago, after the tragedies in Florida, the nightclub and at the concert respectively from 2 years ago. People need to be able to put aside their bottom dollars and their wants for profit and for making a name for themselves and getting reelected and proposing legislation that will get stuff done. This is the dilemma of our problem, and it's going to be up to people like me and others of my age rank who are going to pick up the mantle and take it where it needs to go. Thank you for your time.